All right, ladies and gentlemen, and now we have the second to last installment of the lectures on colonial societies in the New World, and it's really part one and part two because we're going to look now at British North America, but we're going to look at it in two major sections, or else this will create a somewhat larger lecture. British North America is, of course, critically important to the understanding of American history. Of course, it is out of the 13, well, we should really say eventually 14 British North American colonies, if we were to include the British colony north of the St. Lawrence River, Canada. But the so-called 13 British colonies will form the core of the United States after 1783. And so understanding British North America and colonial society is really, in many ways, a recap of what you might have encountered in middle school, and provides a nice refresher course on all of that as you continue in your studies here in high school. So, let's refresh then. The practice of English settlement was actually developed of all places, in Ireland. The British had colonized before. Their colonies were done in Ireland, in and around Londonderry, Dublin, parts of Cork, Belfast in the north, in what they called the Pale of Settlement. And this was basically a region in which English settlers were allowed to settle. The English could not simply go into Ireland and take land anywhere they wanted, although that's eventually what started to happen. And so English settlement was done in a specific area, and basically the Irish were forced out of that area, or became subordinate to the Anglo-Scots population. And so this model is what's recreated in North America. Overall, the English tended to back money-making endeavors. This was about making profit, particularly in the southern portion of the Atlantic seaboard colonies, in the southern colonies. The northern colonies, by contrast, were often initially established in the name of religious freedom, but those colonies also took on a very significant commercial economic system that was not as agricultural as we'll see in the South, but tended to focus more on shipping and producing finished goods in the colonies themselves. The central colonies ended up being, or what we call sort of the mid-Atlantic colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland, tended to be more the agricultural heartland of the English system. Particularly Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York would become kind of the bread baskets of the rest of the colonies. So that whereas the New England colonies weren't really great farmland, if you did farm in New England, you were more of a dairy farmer because of the rocky soil. You needed to have foodstuffs shipped there from the Mid-Atlantic colonies, and if you were a southern farmer, you tended to want to grow, especially in the coastal regions where the climate was better, the growing seasons were longer. Those coastal flatlands tended to be areas where plantation economies were established for cash crops, so you would need to have your food grown elsewhere to supply that. And we can have a look here. This is sort of, let's say, 1700-ish, 1714 or so. The sort of the imperial framework of North America, we see in blue the vast underpopulated French North American colonies. You'll see all the forts that the French established to control that area that really came to naught because they were ill-equipped. You see the much smaller British colonial society there, and then into the south you see in Florida and in Mexico and the American Southwest the Spanish Empire. First, we'll look at the Virginia colony. This is really the first, not the first attempt, but it's the first permanent settlement at Jamestown in the Chesapeake Bay region in 1607, established by the English. Initially, many people were looking for gold. They wanted to make a quick buck in the same way that the Spanish did in central Mexico. That became apparent very early. It was not possible. And so the colonists learned from the Native Americans of this product called tobacco, which became a cash crop, which set the Virginia colony off on a meteoric rise as a wealthy, one of the wealthiest of all the English colonies. By contrast, we'll look at, let's say, Barbados or one of the islands of the Caribbean. Virginia colony, if we compare it to one of those colonies, is pretty much very small potatoes. The tobacco economy of Virginia doesn't hold a candle to the sugar plantation as far as economic output. If you wanted to be fabulously wealthy in the British Empire, you started a sugar plantation in Barbados, not a tobacco plantation in Virginia. Labor was a problem, and so the individuals who could not meet the transportation costs basically sold themselves for a certain period of time, entered into a contract of indenture, became an indentured servant, and would work essentially for free for approximately, depending on how long, on average 20 years. That would cover their costs of coming to the New World, the shipping, basically the ticket to get across the ocean, and then to establish themselves. And if they did that when they were in their 20s, in their early 20s or their late teens, by their late 30s and early 40s, they would be free. If they did make a little bit of money in that time, they might have saved up enough to at least buy a small plot of marginal land and establish themselves and their families as independent small farmers. By the 1600s, the colony was no longer self-governing. The Virginia Company was essentially dissolved, and a royal governor, a royal charter was implemented, and a royal governor was sent to govern the colony. However, there was a representative institution called the House of Burgesses. It's called the House of Burgesses because the people who composed it were burghers. They were townspeople. So the towns were able to send representatives to it. That is, we must remember, that is not indicative of a modern representative government in which both rural folk and town folk were represented. So it's a little bit different here. And again, goes back to sort of English parliamentary history and how commoners typically come from well-defined districts or regions or towns or shires or whatever in England. And that simply was the way in which the House of Burgesses was set up in the Virginia colony. As Virginia colony grew, it grew to the south, and Carolina colony was established, which would, of course, be divided eventually into North Carolina and South Carolina. The Carolina colony was essentially formed because the British were a bit envious of the French ability to fur trap in North America. And it was really fur traders that spread out from Virginia to the south and to the west. At the same time that that's happening, planters from Barbados create a settlement on the mainland at Charlestown, or as we know it today as Charleston. And so really what ends up happening is this Carolina colony, named for a Queen Caroline of England, two very different sort of colonies emerge essentially, but they're part of this one Carolina colony. The northern portion applied sort of the mixed economy of Virginia, where we see some, wheat farming, some fur trapping, some tobacco plantations, while the southern portion of the colony was almost all cash crop. It was rice, which was needed in the Caribbean to provide foodstuffs for folks who were running sugar plantations, for the slaves, and so forth, and indigo, which was a dye and just a pure cash crop. Increasingly, the use of slave labor spread from those early Caribbean sugar plantations to the mainland through Carolina colony and then throughout the rest of the British southern colonies. Eventually, Georgia colony would be established as well as kind of a buffer to the south of Carolina. And this was a debtor colony, kind of almost like an early prison colony, as Australia would be later on, founded by Oglethorpe. And very late, foundation of Georgia is in the early 1700s, around 1708. South Carolina, probably of all of the British North American colonies, tended to be the one that most modeled English society. It tended to be very hierarchical. The planters in South Carolina were aristocratic in their style, in their tastes, in their home construction. And so it's not surprising then that when the American Revolution comes, the people who tended to be most sympathetic to England tended to be the South Carolinians. South Carolina was a hard sell during the American Revolution, or at least that was the common wisdom among the British. And it's true that there was much more resistance, especially among the wealthy planter aristocracy in the Carolinas. It's not so much true, and we should take a moment here to understand this, that in the southern colonies there's a big difference that starts to emerge between those who farmed in the plantations along what's called the tidewater regions, those lowland regions along the coast, and the folks who started to move up into the hillier Piedmont region and mountain regions, the small farms, the wheat farms, the very marginal lands that were farmed as we get up into the Appalachians. This area tended to take on a very different characteristic. In fact, there was a very different type of immigrant who moved to those areas. The Scottish, in particular, Scottish and German settlers tended to move into the Appalachian regions. And so very early on, we begin to see a split in these colonies that will emerge in early America, and will also create a very interesting dynamic as the United States lurches towards the Civil War. A very uneasy relationship in the Confederate States of America between the Tidewater planters who want the Civil War and many of the upland folk who have no desire to preserve the planter aristocracy. So it's a very interesting dynamic that we already see emerging as early as the colonial foundations. Well, that's all we're going to tackle in this first installment of British North America. We will have one more look at that, in which we'll look at the New England colonies and the Mid-Atlantic colonies. And so for now, thank you very much for listening.